My name is Claire Thompson, and for as long as I can remember, my father, Richard, never looked at me the way he looked at my brother, Daniel. Growing up in suburban Illinois, our family looked perfect from the outside. We had a modest colonial house with blue shutters and a freshly mowed lawn. Mom, who everyone called Annie, worked part-time at the library and baked the best pecan pies in the neighborhood. Dad was a high school math teacher, respected by everyone in town. To most people, we seemed warm and close-knit. But behind the front door, there was always an invisible line drawn between me and Daniel. My father never said it out loud, but it was in every gesture. Every sigh when I spoke up, every tight-lipped smile when I brought home an A on a report card that paled in comparison to Daniel's straight A's and varsity trophies. In our living room, a wide brick fireplace held a mantel crowded with Daniel's awards, soccer plaques, debate medals, photos of Dad proudly gripping his shoulder at graduation. My achievements were tucked away in a little wicker basket near the stairs. Sometimes I used to take my own certificates out and line them up next to Daniel's, hoping Dad might notice them. He never did. I learned to manage my expectations early. I knew that if Daniel was home, the best thing I could do was fade quietly into the background. If he made a joke, Dad's laugh would echo through the house, deep and full of pride. If I tried to join in, it trailed off into awkward silence. Mom noticed, of course, she would shoot me little sympathetic looks, but she never challenged Dad outright. She believed in keeping the peace. As the years passed, the dynamic hardened into something I couldn't quite name, but always felt. Even small things reminded me of my place. When I was 13, I spent weeks saving up my allowance to buy Dad a monogrammed mug that said "World's Best Father." He thanked me politely, set it aside, and kept using the old green mug that Daniel had made in art class when he was 9. That mug had a chip in the rim, but he wouldn't drink his morning coffee out of anything else. I wasn't bitter, not exactly more resigned. Daniel was naturally confident, athletic, and brilliant in a way that everyone admired. I was quieter, more introspective, the kind of child who read books under the covers with a flashlight and drew sketches no one ever asked to see. It wasn't that my father disliked me. He just didn't see me. On weekday mornings, Dad would drive us to school. Daniel always sat in the front seat. I'd slide into the back, pressing my cheek to the cold window, listening to them talk about sports stats or college applications. Sometimes Dad would ask, "You good back there, Claire?" I'd say, "I'm fine," and that was usually the end of it. Even as an adult, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father's approval was a currency I could never quite afford. By the time I turned 25, I had moved to Chicago, hoping distance might dull the ache. I worked at a small publishing company and lived in a cramped studio apartment with peeling linoleum floors. But every holiday, I came back home, stepping across that threshold with the same nervous hope. Maybe this time it would feel different. Christmas was the hardest. Every year, Dad gave Daniel something remarkable. Once it was a down payment on a car, another time a check to help with his student loans. For me, there were always gifts too, but smaller ones. Scarves, bath sets, things chosen with polite affection but no deeper knowledge of who I was. I told myself I didn't care, but the lump in my throat said otherwise. It was the Thanksgiving before everything changed when I first glimpsed that something was off. We were all sitting around the table, the smell of roasted turkey filling the house, when I caught Mom watching Dad with an expression I didn't understand. It wasn't pity or annoyance, it was more like guilt. She glanced at me, then looked away quickly when our eyes met. Later that evening, when Daniel and Dad were outside raking leaves, I asked her quietly, "Why do you look at me like that sometimes?" Mom's hands stilled on the dish she was washing. For a moment, I thought she might tell me something important, something I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. But then she shook her head. "Oh, Claire, it's nothing. Just, you're a good person. I hope you know that." It was such an odd thing to say. I tried to press her, but she only patted my shoulder and turned back to the sink. That night, I lay in my old bedroom, staring up at the ceiling fan, replaying the moment again and again. A seed of curiosity had been planted, and no matter how I tried to ignore it, it took root. Was there something I didn't know about my family? About my father's attachment to Daniel? I remembered little things that never made sense. A bill with a name I didn't recognize tucked into Dad's wallet. A phone call he'd hung up the instant I walked in. The way Mom's expression would harden whenever Daniel and Dad were together, laughing about something only the two of them understood. Maybe I had spent my life telling myself a story that wasn't true. Maybe the reasons for my father's favoritism weren't as simple as loving Daniel more. I couldn't have imagined then how far the truth would reach, or how much it would cost me to uncover it. The weeks after Thanksgiving felt strangely heavy, as if I were walking through a fog I couldn't explain. My mind kept circling back to the look in my mom's eyes, to that vague, unsettling sentence, "You're a good person. I hope you know that." What did that mean, really? Why say it then? Back in Chicago, I tried to focus on work. I edited manuscripts during the day and distracted myself with reruns and wine at night. But something had shifted. For the first time, I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. I started wondering if maybe there was a reason Dad had always kept me at arm's length. So, I started digging. It began with a simple idea: go through the old family photos and see what I could find. I drove back to the house 2 weekends later under the excuse of helping Mom clean out the attic before Christmas. She was surprised to see me, but didn't question it. The attic smelled of dust and cardboard, filled with relics from decades of living. A rocking horse Daniel had outgrown, boxes labeled Claire Middle School, old VHS tapes, and Christmas lights. I started sorting through a box marked family photos. There were pictures from my first birthday party, Mom smiling, cake smashed on my face, and Dad in the background, barely looking at the camera. Then came the ones from Daniel's birthdays. Dad front and center, arms wrapped around him. That proud smile always present. I kept flipping until I hit something strange. A photo of Dad holding a newborn, but the timestamp on the back said April 1992. I was born in October that year. Daniel, on the other hand, was born in April. That part matched. But it wasn't the date that caught me off guard. It was the expression on Dad's face, pure, undiluted joy. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I pulled out my baby album. Oddly, there were far fewer photos of me as a newborn. Most were from when I was already a toddler. It struck me how few early memories I had with my dad. When I asked Mom casually over dinner that night why there were fewer baby photos of me, she hesitated. "You know how it is," she said too quickly, brushing imaginary crumbs off her lap. "Second child. Things get busier." "But I'm not the second child," I said softly. "Daniel is." Her hand froze midair. Then, after a beat, she smiled tightly.
"Right.
That's what I meant. Something was wrong. I couldn't stop myself. That night, I snuck into Dad's home office. He always kept the door shut, though never locked. Inside, the room was almost museum-like, everything in its place, stacks of organized folders, a wall lined with books on mathematics, logic, and a few old family yearbooks. In the bottom drawer of his file cabinet, I found a folder labeled simply, Paternity and Legal. My heart dropped. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a sealed envelope addressed to my mom. The second was a notarized letter from 1993 with both my parents' names at the top. The third was a paternity test dated 6 months after I was born. It was addressed to Richard Thompson. And the child tested was me. Positive. 0% probability of paternity. My breath caught in my throat. I read the number over and over again, as if repetition could alter it. My hands were trembling. My father, the man who raised me, was not biologically related to me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Only questions flooded in, one after the other. Who was my father? Did Daniel know? Did Mom know before the test? And worst of all, did Dad love Daniel more because Daniel was really his and I wasn't? The thought pierced through me like ice. I slammed the drawer shut and backed out of the office like I'd committed a crime. The next morning, I didn't confront anyone. I left without saying much, making up some excuse about work. On the drive back to Chicago, my head swirled with memories that suddenly made more sense. How Dad always showed up to Daniel's games, even the away ones. How he taught Daniel to shave, to drive, to fill out college forms. How he never did those things with me. How he kept me at a quiet, cordial distance. I started wondering if he'd resented me this whole time. If I was a living reminder of something my mother had done, a betrayal he couldn't forgive. But why raise me at all? Why stay? In the days that followed, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Every word, every photo, every childhood moment I clung to is now threaded with doubt. The office at work became my escape, but even there I couldn't focus. I called my mom twice. She didn't answer. By the weekend, I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I had to go back and confront her. I needed to hear it from her mouth. I needed to understand why she never told me. I knocked on the door of my childhood home like I didn't belong there anymore. Mom opened the door, surprised to see me again so soon. "Claire?" I didn't wait. "We need to talk," I said. "Now." Her face turned pale, and she stepped aside without a word. We sat in the kitchen, the same place she used to braid my hair before school. "I know Dad's not my biological father," I said quietly. She froze, like I'd dropped a bomb. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. "Claire, I was going to tell you. I swear." "When?" "After he dies? After I spend another 30 years thinking I'm the problem?" She covered her mouth and began to cry. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Then tell me the truth," I whispered. "Tell me everything." She nodded slowly, wiping her face. "You deserve that much." Mom sat across from me, her eyes red and swollen. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was a quiet in the kitchen I'd never heard before, like the house itself was holding its breath. "I was 27, she began, voice shaking. "Your father and we were going through a rough time. Daniel was just a toddler, and your father had taken a job that kept him away from home for weeks at a time. I felt alone. I made a mistake." She closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "He never forgave me," she whispered. "Who was it?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and brittle. Her fingers twisted in her lap. "It doesn't matter who he was. He didn't stay. When I found out I was pregnant, I told Richard. He said we would raise you as his own, that we would never speak of it again. But he knew. The whole time," I said, a dull ache in my chest. "He knew I wasn't his." Mom nodded. "He agreed to stay in the marriage for Daniel's sake. And then when you were born, I think he tried, Claire. I think he wanted to love you the same. But every time he looked at you, he saw what I did." A sharp, nauseating heat flushed my skin. The realization was worse than I'd imagined. His distance hadn't been about me failing him. It had been about Mom. About a secret I'd never asked to be part of. "He never even tried to tell me?" I asked. "No. He said it wouldn't change anything. He wanted you to have a normal childhood." I let out a hollow laugh. "Normal?" I spent my entire life wondering why he looked through me. "Claire, I am so sorry." I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to shut out the memories that were already shifting into something uglier. All the times I'd begged for his attention. All the ways I'd tried to measure up to Daniel. And none of it had ever been possible. I couldn't look at her anymore. "I have to go. Please." But I was already standing, already grabbing my bag. She didn't try to stop me. In the car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, breathing through the sick feeling in my stomach. I didn't start the engine right away. I needed to think, to decide what came next. I knew one thing. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't keep showing up at family gatherings, sitting across the table from Dad like everything was fine. Like the truth hadn't been sitting there between us all along. By the time I pulled out of the driveway, a plan had begun to form. One that felt reckless and necessary all at once. I was going to talk to Dad. I was going to hear it from him, in his own words. I drove back to my apartment in Chicago and called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring, sounding groggy. "Claire? What's going on? Did you know?" I blurted out. "Know what?" "That Dad isn't really my father." There was a long, stunned pause. "What are you talking about?" he asked carefully. "Mom told me everything," I said. "There was a paternity test. He knew. For years. Daniel let out a slow exhale. Jesus.
No.
I didn't know. I believed him. Of all people, Daniel had never needed to lie about being Dad's favorite. Are you okay? He asked. No, I said honestly. But I'm going to be. After we hung up, I lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling. I thought about all the times I'd assumed Daniel had some secret formula for winning Dad's love. All the years I'd convinced myself I just wasn't enough. And now I knew. It had never been about my worth. It had been about my existence. The next morning, I called Dad's cell. He answered with that clipped tone he always used when he was annoyed. Claire. I need to talk to you, I said. In person. What about? You know what about. Silence stretched between us. Fine, he said finally. Come by this evening. I hung up without saying goodbye. All day, I rehearsed what I would say. I would ask him why he stayed. Why he never told me the truth. Why he couldn't just love me anyway. When I pulled into the driveway that night, the porch light was on. He was waiting in the living room, sitting in his armchair with his hands folded in his lap. You talked to your mother, he said, voice flat. Yes. He nodded, as if bracing himself for a fight. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked. His eyes flickered up to meet mine, tired and sad. Because you were just a baby. You didn't ask to be part of any of it. I thought maybe if we didn't talk about it, it wouldn't matter. But it did matter, I said. My voice cracked. It mattered every single day. He looked down at his hands. I know. You never even tried, I whispered. You never even gave me a chance. He closed his eyes. For the first time in my life, he looked ashamed. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't know how to separate you from what she did. That wasn't fair to you. I swallowed hard. The hurt was too big to fit inside me. I'm going to find out who he was, I said. I have to. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything. I stood there a moment longer, waiting for him to offer something. Anything that might make it hurt less. But there was nothing left to say. When I left, I felt something close to relief. The truth was out. There would be no more pretending. But there was also something else, a quiet determination. I was going to find out where I came from, no matter what it took. Finding out who my biological father was became an obsession. Not out of longing or hope, but because I needed answers. I needed to understand what kind of man had been woven into my DNA. What part of me had been rejected before I was even born. I started with the envelope I had taken from Dad's file cabinet, the one addressed to my mom. It was still sealed when I opened it. Inside was a short, handwritten letter. Annie, if you're reading this, it means I've decided to walk away from all of it. I can't be part of Claire's life without destroying what's left of yours. I'll always wonder what could have been, but I know this is the right thing to do. That was it. No last name. No address. Just the initial, T. I stared at it for a long time, memorizing the loops and angles of the handwriting, like it might unlock something in me. I wanted to scream. Who was T? Why didn't he fight for me? The next day, I returned to Mom's house again. I didn't give her a warning this time. She looked startled when she saw me at the door, but she stepped aside and let me in. I want to know who he was, I said without sitting down. No more secrets. No more vague letters. Tell me his name. She sank into the kitchen chair, visibly older than she had looked just weeks before. Thomas Dillard, she whispered. The name meant nothing to me. He was a friend of your father's. They went to college together. He was living in Chicago back then, working as a photojournalist. It was only a few months. He left when I told him I was pregnant. I didn't know he sent that letter. My breath caught. Dad knew him. She nodded. They were friends before everything. But after, Richard cut him out completely. It was like Thomas vanished. I wasted no time. That night, I searched every database I could access. I found dozens of Thomas Dillards, some too young, some too old, some already dead. Then, finally, I found one that matched the timeline. Thomas Dillard, 59, former freelance photojournalist, last known address in Madison, Wisconsin. I stared at his profile for nearly an hour before I worked up the courage to message him on an old professional photography website that hadn't been updated since 2014. Hi, Thomas. My name is Claire Thompson. I believe you may have known my mother, Annie Thompson, in the early 1990s. I'd like to speak with you, if you're open to it. I didn't expect a response, but the next morning I got one. Claire. I've waited 30 years for this message. My hands shook as I read it. We agreed to meet that weekend at a coffee shop halfway between Madison and Chicago. I drove in silence, heart pounding the entire way. When I arrived, he was already there, gray hair, weathered face, eyes the exact shade of green as mine. The resemblance was instant and undeniable. Hi, I said, barely able to speak. Hi, Claire. He smiled softly. You look just like your mother did at your age. We sat down, both unsure where to begin. You knew about me? I asked. He nodded. Your mother told me. I offered to stay. I wanted to, but she said she and Richard were going to raise you together, and I wasn't in a place to fight that. I was young, broke, and scared. And your dad, he was furious. You walked away, I said, not as an accusation, just a fact. I did, he admitted, and I've regretted it every single day. There was a silence between us that felt oddly familiar, like we were both standing on opposite sides of a river we didn't know how to cross. I spent my whole life wondering what was wrong with me, I said. Now I know it wasn't me. He reached across the table, tentative. It was never you, Claire. That moment felt like a thread snapped inside me. I didn't cry, not there. But I felt something shift, like I had taken my first breath in years. We spent hours talking. He told me about his career, about the places he'd traveled, the things he'd seen. He never married, never had other children. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder what kind of person you were becoming, he said. I told myself I didn't deserve to know. We talked until the sun started to set. As I stood to leave, he asked quietly, Would you want to see me again? I nodded. Yeah, I think I would. When I drove home, I felt strangely light, like my life, fractured as it was, had found a missing piece. I told Daniel everything the next day. He was quiet at first, then asked, Do you feel better now that you know? I thought about it. Not better, just clearer. Then came the hardest part. I went to see Dad again. He opened the door and stepped aside wordlessly. I met him, I said. Thomas, my biological father. Dad sat down slowly, as if bracing for pain. I just want you to know, I continued, that I don't hate you. I understand why you stayed. I understand why it hurt. But I needed to know where I came from. And I'm glad I finally do. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time in my life, he said, I'm sorry I couldn't love you the way you deserved. It broke something in me, but also stitched something back together. I deserved the truth, I said. That's all I ever wanted. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But for once, there was nothing left unspoken. I drove home from my father's house that night feeling emptied out and strangely at peace. The streetlights blurred into golden smudges along the highway, and I let them pass without really seeing them. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to wonder anymore. The truth, as jagged and imperfect as it was, had finally been spoken. The days that followed were quiet. I stayed in Chicago, called in to work to take a few days off, and spent long hours just sitting by my apartment window, thinking. I thought about Mom and how much guilt she'd carried all these years. I thought about Dad and how his inability to forgive had stolen something precious from both of us. And I thought about Thomas, how strange it felt to have his name in my life now, this man who is a stranger, and yet somehow not. Daniel called me the next week to check in. He'd been gentle since I told him everything, careful not to act like it wasn't a big deal. Have you talked to Mom? He asked. Not since the night she told me. Maybe you should. I hesitated. Part of me still wanted to punish her with silence, to make her feel the same loneliness I'd carried for so long. But another part of me, the part that had always wanted to be seen and loved, knew I couldn't hold on to that forever. 2 days later, I drove out to the house one more time. She answered the door looking tired, her hair pulled back in a way that reminded me of when I was little, and she was late picking me up from school.
"Hi," I said.
She swallowed, her eyes glossy. "Hi." I stepped inside and set my purse down. We stood in the kitchen again, the place where all of this had started. "I'm not here to yell," I said. "I don't even think I'm here for answers anymore. I wanted you to know that I'm okay." She covered her mouth with one hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I never wanted you to feel unloved." "I know," I whispered. "I know you tried." I didn't forgive her, not fully. Not yet. But in that moment, I could see her as more than the woman who'd kept a secret from me. I could see her as a person who had been scared, who had made mistakes she'd never stopped paying for. We sat together for a long time, neither of us saying much. It was the first real quiet we'd shared in years. After I left, I called Thomas. We met again that weekend, this time in a small park in Madison. He brought an old camera, the strap worn smooth by years of use. "Thought you might want to see some of the places I've been," he said, handing me a stack of photographs. They were beautiful. Images of sunrises in places I'd never heard of, street scenes in countries I'd only read about. But what caught my eye was a photo tucked near the bottom, a black and white shot of my mother, sitting in what must have been his apartment, her hair loose around her face. "She looks so young," I said. "She was," he murmured. I studied the picture for a while, trying to imagine their lives before everything fell apart. Two people who had been in love, however briefly. Two people who'd made me. When I looked up, he was watching me carefully. "You don't have to let me into your life if you don't want to," he said. "I understand if this is too much." But I surprised us both when I said, "I'd like to get to know you." He smiled, and it struck me again how familiar that expression was, like seeing my own face in a mirror I hadn't known existed. Over the next few weeks, we spoke often. He told me about the assignments he'd taken, the risks he'd chased, the places he'd lived. I told him about my job, my tiny apartment, the way I'd always felt like something was missing. It was cautious at first, but it was real. At Christmas, I decided not to go home. Mom and Dad understood. Instead, I invited Thomas to meet me in Chicago. We sat in my kitchen drinking coffee, and he gave me a small, wrapped box. Inside was a framed photograph, a picture he'd taken of a lighthouse on a stormy night. The beam cutting through the darkness. "I thought you might like it," he said quietly. I traced my finger along the glass. "Thank you." When he left that evening, I hung the photo on my wall. It felt like a symbol of something I hadn't had words for, a steady light I hadn't known I needed. In January, Daniel came to visit. We walked along the frozen lakefront, bundled in coats and scarves. "You seemed lighter," he said. "I feel lighter." He stopped and looked at me. "You know, you were always enough, even when Dad didn't show it." I blinked back sudden tears. "Thank you." It was true. I knew that now in a way I hadn't before. Dad and I still weren't close, and maybe we never would be. But I could look at him without wondering what was wrong with me. That was something I never thought I'd be able to say. The hurt hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, become something I could carry without letting it define me. Months later, as spring finally began to thaw the city, I found myself sitting by my window again, watching the sun go down. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been, the child desperate to be loved, the woman afraid of the truth, the daughter brave enough to claim her own story. I wasn't sure what the future would look like. But for the first time, I believed I had the right to decide for myself. I was more than the secret that had shaped my life. More than the distance my father could never bridge. I was my own person.
And that was enough.